pounds on me, so I got that fire on me. In the desert heat, I'm burning marijuana, trying to fill bags with green and blue cheese. In the city, the only thing that matters is the money, and that's the only thing I want, honey. I live the life that's crummy, so I want my gold like a day sunny. Once upon a time.
Hey, this is Bird Rabbit, and this is the Mitra Blue episode series. For today, we are going to be continuing the book read. What book? We are going to be continuing Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage. We finished the first chapter, and we left off in the middle of the second chapter. So let's finish that chapter, and let's have some fun. So, let's get to it. Alrighty. There is no way of knowing how long the settlement remained free of European intervention. Within a century, the march of white conquest would spill into the lovely streams and forests, but while this black Indian community lived, it provided Americans with an example of frontier hospitality, peace, and democratic camaraderie. Some among us will mourn the symbolic loss of the white pioneers at Roanoke Island, Jamestown, or Plymouth. The fables about them make pleasant reading, but their supporters can't take heart from the brave heritage bequeathed us by the African freedom fighters who fled San Miguel de Guadalupe, and by Native Americans who took them in as sisters and brothers. Here is a gallant American tradition that ranks with those established by other fighting Americans at Concord Bridge and Valley Forge. The story of this new community shows that our vaunted democracy did not march into the wilderness with buckled shoes and British accents. Rather, it was dancing around fireplaces in South Carolina, wrapped in dried animal skin and singing African and native songs before the British arrived. This dark democracy lived in family groups before London companies sent our settlers with muskets, Bibles, and concepts of private property. The black Indians of the Pee River became the first colony of this continent to practice the belief that all people, newcomer and native, are equal and are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There is a story worth teaching our children. It began with Columbus. For the people of the Americas, the arrival of Columbus was hardly a blessing. On his first day, October 12, 1492, the explorer wrote in his diary, "I took some of the natives by force." He later found the original inhabitants to be traceable, peaceable, and concluded there is not in the world a better nation. Yep, there's not in the world a better nation. His response as a European was to say that Indians must be made to work and adopt our ways. The Christopher Columbus, whose unique seamanship and courage had opened the Americas to European penetration. Arthur must have fun with that wordplay. Let's start over. The Christopher Columbus, whose unique seamanship and courage had opened the Americas to European penetration, also began the transatlantic slave trade. He started by shipping 10 chain Arawak men and women to Seville, Spain in 1498. He wrote enthusiastically to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella about the business possibilities. From here in the name of the blessed Trinity, we can send all the slaves that can be sold. When he loaded 1,100 Taino men and women aboard for Spanish ships, the crowding and storming Atlantic crossing took a fearful toll. Only 300 survived, but Columbus and Spain had decided to continue the profitable slave trade from the Americas. Seville became the slave capital of Spain. Spanish priests were the first to denounce the horrors of bondage. In 1511, Dominican Frere Montesinos called slavery a mortal sin and said cruelty and tyranny over Indians could not be justified by Christians. A few years later, Bishop Las Casas, who had witnessed countless Indians massacred by his fellow Spaniards, blamed greed for the horrors. They killed them, Indians, because they want to be rich and have much gold, which is their sole aim. Las Casas concluded that in the New World, Spaniards had become devils and Indians were the only true Christians. Las Casas led the determination effort to halt Indian bondage. He pointed out that Indians died off by thousands from slavery and European diseases. Forced labor in Spanish mines in the Americas was so harsh that average worker died before he was 26. To meet their need for more laborers, Europeans looked next to Africa. The strongest sons and daughters of Africa were seized in their homes or fields or purchased from local traders. They were packed into cargo ships and shipped across the Atlantic. Since the 1500s, this mixture of people, Native American and African American, and Spanish priests shown here at the Shiprock Indian Agency have been a part of the southwestern U.S. history. Here's a picture. Yeah. So these are some mixture of some natives and some African and a Spanish priest. Crazy. Thomas Brannigan, a Dublin youth who for many years served as a seaman aboard slave ships, described the boarding scene. Children are torn from their distracted parents, parents from their screaming children, wives from their frantic husbands, husbands from their violated wives, brothers from their loving sisters, sisters from their affectionate brothers. See them collected in flocks, like a herd of swine driven to the ships. They cry, they struggle, they resist, but all in vain. No eye pities, no hand helps. The first Africans brought to the New World by European slavery probably arrived in April 1502 aboard the ship that brought the new governor of Hispaniola, Nicolas de Ovando. Soon after they landed, some Africans escaped to the woods and found a new home among the Native Americans. Later that year, Governor Ovando sent a request to King Ferdinand that no more Africans be sent to the Americas. His reason was simple. They fled amongst the Indians and taught them bad customs and never could be captured. Why did he feel they could be retaken? Had the two people united as a military force at this early date? Were Native Americans prepared to drive off European slave hunters? Was an alliance taking shape in the woods between two peoples who opposed the Spanish conquerors? The answer to these questions are unclear, but Governor Ovando is describing more than a problem of bad, untrusty servants. His words are more than complaints about difficulties of recapturing fugitives in a tropical rainforest. Governor Ovondo's words in 1502 are the first hints of a growing problem for the European masters of the New World, the first notice of the new relationships budding beyond their control. Africans arrived on their shores with valuable assets for both Europeans and Native Americans. They were used to agricultural labor and work in the field gained something unfamiliar to most Indians. As experts in tropical agriculture, they had a lot to teach both white and red people. Further, Africans had a virtual immunity to European diseases such as smallpox, which wiped out Native Americans. For Europeans seeking a source of labor that could not escape, Africans were ideal because they were 3,000 miles from home. They could not flee to loved ones as Indian slaves could. African men and women who fled could always be identified by skin color, and black became a bandage of bondage. Native Americans soon discovered that Africans had some gift that made them uniquely valuable. Through their slave experience, they qualified as experts on whites. Their diplomacy, armaments, motives, strengths, and weaknesses, escaped slaves came bearing a knowledge of their master's language, defenses, and plans. Sometimes Africans were able to carry off muskets, machetes, or valuable gunpowder. For these reasons, their role could be crucial to Native Americans, their place secure in the village life. A common foe, not any special affinity of skin color, became the first link of friendship, the earliest motivation for an alliance. Next, the two people began to discover they shared some vital views of life. Family was basic importance to both, with children and elderly children. Excuse me. Let's read that passage over. Next, the two people began to discover they shared some vital views of life. Family of basic importance to both, with children and the elderly treasured. Religion was daily part of cultural life, not merely practiced on Sundays. Both Africans and Native Americans found they shared a belief in economic cooperation rather than competition and rivalry. Each people was proud, but neither was weighed down by prejudice. But neither was weighed down by prejudice. Skill, friendships, and trust, not skin color or race, were important. Since Indians willingly adopted people into their village, Africans found they were welcome. In the century following Columbus' landing, millions of Native Americans died from the combination of European diseases, harsh treatment, and murder. Africans took their places in the mines and fields in the New World. The estimate 80 million Native Americans alive in 1492 became only 10 million left alive centuries later. But the 10,000 Africans working in the Americas in 1527 had, by the end of the century, became 90,000 people. These figures are even more striking within local areas. In 1519, when Spaniards arrived, Mexico had a population of 25 million Indians. By the end of the century, only 1 million were still alive. The invaders calculated that more profit would be made if laborers worked to death and replaced. In their plans, pain and suffering did not count, and no cruelty was considered excessive. Out of the shifting labor forces of new populations emerged, mixed Africans and Native Americans. By 1650. Mexico alone had an African Indian population, some with white ancestry, of 100,000. A new race was being born. In 1510, King Ferdinand's vision of gold dancing before his eyes lifted all restrictions on sending Africans to the Americas. He promised to send all that were needed and included a trustworthy person to be in charge of each group. In this way, he said slaves and masters would share in gold they may collect, and slaves would receive the ease if they work well. This was an ideal dream. The slaves' population expanded, but was never rewarded with ease for its great toil. Europeans' masters continued to drive those in chains as hard as they could. Ease only came when people escaped to the forests and swamps. Increasingly, Africans and the remaining enslaved Indians fled their masters and created their own secret colonies beyond European eyes. In time, these would pose the most disruptive challenge the European colonial system faced in Americas. In the age of Columbus and Las Casas, this threat was not clear. Europeans counted their profits and kept importing Africans. In 1511, Governor Ovando forgot his position to importing Africans as slaves. One black, he marveled, can do the work of 4 Indians. Here, he believed, was a danger worth the prize. His fellow Europeans heartily agreed with him. From then on, slavery would expand brutally, would keep it in place, and whites swept enormous profits. Here's some pictures. And here's one. When captured, Native American resistant leaders were ceremonially put to death. In 1512, Hatui, a Taino who fought in the invaders in Hispaniola and Cuba, was captured and was asked him by a priest if he first wanted to accept baptism so he could enter heaven and meet God. No, he answered, I would only find more Christians there. Too funny. Nice. Here's another one. Caribbeans were among the earliest victims of Spain invasion. Man. Alright. We reached chapter 3. So we have 16 minutes on the board. So let's continue. Alright, chapter 3. Between the races, we cannot dig deep a gulf. Excuse me. Let's redo that. In 1522, Europeans in the Americas first learned that slavery did not easily or painlessly lead to enormous wealth on Christmas Day. African and Indian slaves on a plantation owned by Diego Columbus rose and murdered their masters and overseers. Nearby Native Americans joined in the rebels. The beautiful island of Hispaniola shook with one of the first recorded slave rebellion in the New World. The conspiracy had spread across the sprawling sugar plantations. In the weeks before Christmas, patiently the plotters waited until Christmas Day, when the planters and their families would be bloated with food soaked with liquor and too weak or sleepy to offer much resistance. Then they struck, plunging into the night to kill whites and find freedom. For 2 days, they met little opposition, but on the third, Spanish troops caught up with the rebels in an open field and opened fire. The fugitives broke for the woods. The Europeans were unfamiliar with the treacherous terrain near the city of Santo Domingo. Few were willing to pursue their most dangerous slaves into an area suited to guerrilla warfare. Governor Diego Columbus, his Spanish troops and advisors decided on a new strategy. Governor hired Native Americans for the dangerous task of tracking the fugitives. A hunt began. The exact outcome is unclear. Nice. I was just revising what I just read. So the governor hired Native Americans for the dangerous task of tracking the fugitives. So they hired Native Americans to track the African and Indian slaves on the plantation owned by Diego Columbus. So that's my understanding of what I just read. So let's continue. All right. Slavery and resistance spread. Masters and slaves learned some important lessons. From this first bloody confrontation, enslaving Indians and Africans was not going to be free of pain. Was not going to be free of pain. Masters in a slave land would not sleep easily each night. Europeans concluded it was absolutely necessary to remain armed and use one race to fight the other. A French colonel dispatched later in the century put the matter simply. The law is hard, but is both wise and necessary in a land of 15 slave to 1 white. Between the races, we cannot dig too deep of a gulf. We cannot dig too deep a gulf. The enslaved also learned some lessons. Their owners would rise to any level of violence and arm anyone to protect bondage in their grip on the Americas. Europeans would throw their own soldiers into a fray of hire Indians living nearby. Slaves began to reason that their success might depend upon their abilities to make friends among neighboring Indians. Friends do not hunt friends. The European policies of divide and conquer that began on Christmas Day, 1522, introduced elements of deep division to the Americas. Slavery and its cruel legacy left a bloody trail across the grass and soil of the Americas. It spread southward and westward from the Caribbean to Mexico and along the coastline of South America to Cape Horn, where Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans met. But another American tradition also took root. The men and women enslaved in the New World began a pattern of resistance. The first enslaved were the first to flee, the first to rebel, the first to announce that chains were meant to be broken. The spirit of rebellion spread like wildfire that no European power could put out. In the next 10 years, revolts spread to Colombia, Panama, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Mexico. In 1537, a major insurrection threatened Spanish headquarters at Mexico City. Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza reported that Africans had chosen a king and had agreed to kill all Spaniards, and that the Indians were also with them. Terrified Mexican officials agreed to halt any further importations of Africans. Importations of Africans. Slave resistance had temporarily halted the African slave trade. By 1570s, the flames of revolts were burning brightly in Mexico. 1 in every 10 slaves was living in a free life in hiding. Alarmed about the safety of whites, Viceroy Martin Enriquez, 1568-1580, wrote, "The King of Spain, Your Majesty, the time is coming when these African people will become masters of the Indians, enemies much as they were born among them, and their maidens, and are men who dare to die as well as any Spaniard in the world. I do not know who will be in a position to resist them." Let's read that over. Your Majesty, and the time is coming when these Africans people will have become masters of the Indians, inasmuch as they were born among them and their maidens, and are men who dare to die as well as any Spaniard in the world. I do not know who will be in any position to resist them. It was in Mexico that Europeans tested their strongest efforts to keep Africans apart from Native Americans. Black men far outnumbered their women and sought Indian wives. A Native American wife meant, if she was free, that children born to her would be free, not slaves. Let's read that over. It was in Mexico that Europeans tested their strongest efforts to keep Africans apart from Native Americans. Black men far outnumbered their women and sought Indian wives. A Native American wife meant if she was free, that children was born to her would be free, not slaves. So extensive was the contact between red and black people that Spanish law prohibited the two races from living together or marrying. As early as 1523, Hernando Cortez was given a royal order to keep Indians in their villages, apart from Africans at all costs. This was only 7 years after Venice, Italy, isolated its Jews in the first ghetto in history. One royal order forbade trade, commerce, or communication. On a royal order forbade trade, commerce, or communication between the two people of color. They were forbidden to sell chickens, fruits, and vegetables, and both defied the law. And here's a picture. Drawing. Alright. This early French engraving of Osage Indian Nation captures many skin colors through the artist has given all a Roman nose. Racial mixing was so common in Mexico that it became hard to tell by skin color who was free and who was a slave. King Philip complained that young black Indians committed crimes and then dressed as Indians so they could hide out in their mother's relatives and could not be found. The genetic blending of the two people clearly weakened the control the Europeans wanted over their slaves. Europeans feared any dark person might be a slave driven to desperation or out for revenge. One lived in constant fear, wrote a Spanish colonist. Maroon settlement. From the time of Columbus, the gravest threat to the European domination of the Western Hemisphere came from outlaw communities, former slaves. These maroon colonies, as they were called, were considered a knife poised at the throat of the slave system. Some fearful Europeans saw them as a sword pressed against their entire colonial system in the Americas, and they had a point. Men and women maroons saw their settlements as the fulfillment of the American dream. A sheltered home and freedom, they were placed for families to educate their young, develop their agriculture and trade, practice religion, justice, and government. As outlaw communities, they operated in remote, difficult to find, and hard to defeat locations. Maroons considered each day of survival a small miracle and were thankful for each new dawn as a free man or woman. Some colonies were begun by a single African or Indian, and others were the result of several or many slaves fleeing together. The history of the Saramaka people of Suriname in South America started around 1685, when African and native slaves escaped together formed a maroon society. For 8 generations, Dutch armed forces tried to crush their community, but today it is still alive and boasts 20,000 members. For the Saramaka liberty came 1761, when Europeans abandoned their wars and sued for peace. From their first day, maroon colonies faced enormous problems. They had to quickly find a safe location, plan defense, and feed and clothe their people, and plan the life of a stable community. Women were usually short-supplied, and maroon raids sought to bring back African or Indian wives. Families. This early French print America shows Native Americans and Africans dancing together, a universal symbol of friendship. So this is a drawing of African and Native Americans. Dancing and blending, mixing. Alright. Families meant that communities would last and remain at peace, and that their soldiers would fight harder for their loved ones and children were at risk. Some Maroons preached near large cities and lived in bandits. They raided local plantations, merchants, and even Indians and slaves. Their communities were unstable, often had few women and children, and usually disappeared into the violence they helped create. Although some earned a reputation for daring raids on rich Europeans, many were feared by people of every race. Fear of attack haunted every Maroon settlement. It was a danger they could count on. Johannes King, an African who lived among the Matawa Indians in the Guyanas in 1885, recalled his people struggled to stay alive during these decades of warfare. Here is a story of our ancestors and of their difficulties while they were at war with the Bakra whites. At that time, they suffered severe shortage and were living under dreadful conditions, but lack of food was their worst problem. They didn't even have time to clear and plant gardens to produce food. The whites were always pursuing and attacking. They slashed the crops to bits, ruining everything they saw. They set fires to everything they didn't want to carry off with them. Well, that enraged our early ancestors against the whites. The planning of defense and agriculture in most black Indian settlements drew largely on African models and experience. However, no type of influence was discarded. These colonies grasped aspects of Indian and African, even enslaved life considered vital for survival. The Africans' influence was strong in tropical Maroon locations, and their African methods of planting, irrigation, and harvesting held sway under African-type governments. Africans, as experts on tropical agriculture, had a lot to teach both Indians and Europeans. A leading defense technique, planting sharp sticks in a pit of covering it with thick grass to trap intruding armies, was Africans. It was not only inflicted terrible damage, but terrified any invading army with the thought that sudden a horrible death could occur at any moment. These pits were almost impossible to detect. Men and women who was once starved and beaten by masters grew strong and vigorous in these hidden communities. Maroon settlements took such daring names as God Knows Me and None Else. Disturb me if you dare. Come try me if you be men. And shall I molder before I shall be taken. Maroon self-esteem seemed to grow with each month of liberty. It also sprang from the knowledge that Europeans were often afraid to march out and challenge their communities' defenses. Their self-respect grows because they fear whites have them. Wrote to Portuguese colonists to King Hoyo, whatever the fuck his name is, in 1719. Maroon music also reflected the confidence settlements had in their military strength. Maroon song preserved a generation in Brazil, assured villagers their enemies were doomed. Black men rejoice, white men won't come here, and if he does, the devil will take him off. Nice. Yeah, Brazil pretty black as fuck. Brazil black as fuck, dog. Maroon culture drew from experience of African nations, Native Americans, and what people of color learned about Europeans as slaves or free men and women. Africans so far from home made special efforts to preserve their ancestral ways and pass them on to their children and others who would listen. African patterns prominent in farming and defense were also important in the government administration of justice and religion. Many Maroon colonies adopted forms of Christianity but allowed a number of competing religions to flourish. In some villages and families, mystic religions played a vital part in the way people faced the threats around them. Maroons felt convinced each day to still alive was worthy of a blessing to a powerful outside force. To the surprising of Europeans, many Maroon colonies became successful, independent farming communities. In the 18th century, Captain John Stedman, leading the Dutch troops against Maroons in the Guianas, wrote the Maroon foods were superior to European products and in great supply. Men and women in the Maroon settlements were often described as healthy, tall, muscular, a tribute to their diets and their freedom. For some colonies, trade became vital parts of the economic life. Men and women ventured out to exchange their farm produce and valuable guns, ammunition, and sometimes gold and jewelry. Trade was carried with slaves and masters, Indians and Europeans, and free black people. The prosperity of colonies made them object to envy and then attacked by Europeans. Those Maroons most likely to face military assault by invading armies were situated on land. Situated on land Europeans wanted. Other were invaded because they were engaged in business whites sought to control. Others were invaded because they were engaged in business whites sought out to control. And here's a picture, a drawing. Seems like a court. Maroon leaders are sentenced by a French colonial court. Man. Alright. Black Indians in Venezuela in 1728, for example, ran a successful shipping operation Europeans wanted, led by a man named Juan Edresote. They carried cacao from Spanish merchants in the Uruguay Valley to Dutch merchants on the Carucao. I don't know how to say none of this. About 150 miles away, Philip V of Spain awarded his European friends a monopoly of this trade, placing them on a collision course with the business run by Adressate in 1732. Spain sent out 250 soldiers, including 150 men conscripted from Indians and African slaves, to challenge the businessmen of Adressate. Alright. So we're gonna finish this this passage here, then we're gonna take a break. Outside of the town of Cabrera, Adressate quickly changed from shipping experts to guerrilla warrior. He maneuvered his army into battle with such skill that slave and native soldiers deserted the European command. Adressate's sharpshooters musket fire then brought down all but 44 European soldiers, but Spain had not given up. It sent 1,500 troops after Adressate, and he had to slip off to Caruca to save his life. His brother Jose Francisco rallied the Black Indians, but they were no match for such an overwhelming force. However, it did take Spain another 5 years to eliminate their dark business competitors in a Uruguay Valley. It is unclear whether Europeans more often fought or traded with their Black Indian competitors. Colonial law often threw whites in jail for trading with the outlawed Maroon communities on their borders. But some Europeans considered this was a cost to be born and carry on a successful business. It may have seemed strange to have former slaves and their former masters trading like equals, but both saw a profit in their exchange and conducted themselves like good business people. Very interesting. Maroon people became businessmen in their community and traded with former slave owners. Some were outlawed, looked down upon by trading with their former slaves. But business is business. Business is business, my guy. So that was an interesting read, and we finished the second chapter, and we're in the middle of the third. So let's highlight this so we'll know where we at. And while we do that, alright, we'll highlight it. Give a little star. Hope it didn't bleed through. Yeah. Alright. So we left a little star, so where we left off. And we'll read this again soon. But I enjoyed it. It's a interesting book. And I do like it, man. And we'll continue, read another one. This book, I want to get down to Black Indian slave narratives. We'll get to that one. Then we'll get to some, what is it called? Buffalo Soldiers. Then I also got some Adolf. That Adolf. We'll read about that Adolf. Alright, so this is the Mitra Blue episode series, and I hope you enjoyed that read. Thank you.